In this episode, the featured film introduces the viewer to what I think is Hollywood's favorite genre. It tells the story of a larger-than-life hero who undertakes an odyssey to solve a big problem, and once again demonstrates how great the films were from the golden decade of the golden age of Hollywood. These stories and more from the 22nd row. The Searchers was released in 1956, and the setting of the film is 1868. Now that might suggest that we refer to westerns as period pieces, but we really don't, since all westerns take place many years, usually 100 years at least, before the release of the film. So they're called westerns and not period pieces. Now almost all western stories take place between about 1850 and 1905, with the majority falling between 1865 and 1890. One of the reasons for this is because of the U.S. Civil War, which took place between 1861 and 1865. Frontiersmen, cowboys, settlers signed up for the armies of either the Union or the Confederate States of America, the two sides in the Civil War. And therefore, any stories about these people usually would be considered Civil War stories and not westerns. So the genre is more war, Civil War, and maybe a little bit of western. But the majority of Civil War stories take place between 1865 and 1890. So The Searchers is set in 1868, with an uncle returning from this war, and a couple of years, 3 years afterwards, and some adventures that he doesn't talk too much about. Immediately upon arriving at his brother's place in the middle of nowhere, a tragedy occurs, and he decides, without a second's hesitation, to take care of business and do something about it. So that's the start point for our story. And this story is a western. So where did westerns come from? Now, westerns aren't as old as Hollywood. They are older than Hollywood. In fact, the first westerns were filmed right at the dawn of the motion picture business, when motion picture cameras were invented. In 1903, there was a film called The Great Train Robbery, and there were many films made during this period that featured western themes. Immediately, audiences liked cowboys, horses, guns, whatever. And so these films were quite popular for the next 12 years when Hollywood came into being, and then Hollywood took over. And so for the remainder of the silent era, the Western film was probably as popular as the comedy, because of course they were in a visual medium. So why were these films so popular then and just as popular now? Well, the first thing we have to remember that this was a visual medium, not a talking medium. So let's look at the essence of the Western. What is the most intrinsic element of a Western film? The horse. Now, even if you're not an animal lover, a horse is a majestic animal. Looks great, photographs well, whether it's trotting or galloping or just standing still, they're pretty impressive creatures. And they've been around forever, pulling chariots 3,000 years ago, or wagons, or stagecoaches, or whatever for the next 3,000 years. So they're a staple. So we have a horse, very eye-appealing, visually very stunning, watching a horse running across the screen. And in fact, if we remember, a photograph of a horse galloping, taken in the 1870s, actually was one of the catalysts that led to the creation of the motion picture camera. So it's not a bad thing to have a horse in a movie. Well, now we got to put somebody on that horse. So we have men and women who sit on top of a horse. And if they are in a situation where they have to do something other than roam around cities, which of course they did, they would be dressed very differently than the average person. They would have cowboy boots, boots that fit into the stirrups snugly, so it would be really hard to lose control of those stirrups. The stirrups is where the boot goes in beside the horse's massive frame. The next thing would be pants. They would wear working pants, and they would have a leather cover over these pants, which I believe are called chaps, which is to protect the pants and protect against various environmental problems. Finally, they'd have a kerchief around their neck that they would be able to pull up when they were riding the horse, that would protect their mouth and nose against dust or anything else that was happening if they were galloping or if they were just in a stormy situation. And of course, the most iconic part of the cowboy cowgirl uniform, if you will, is the hat. The cowboy hat is as a symbolic of a Western as the horse. And there are as many different hats as there are cowboys and cowgirls. So that's a absolute complete element of the Western. So we have a man and woman astride a horse, very good to look at. They're very attractive, even from a distance. Look at what they're wearing, look at how they're dressed, look at the funny hats they wear, etc., etc. Now, I know for a fact that this is very photogenic because just recently I came across a picture of my grandfather. Now, in 1917, my father was in the Army. He was actually in the horse artillery, and there's a particularly wonderful photograph of him astride a horse, a beautiful military horse. They only, I think, picked the best horses that were available, in uniform. Now, he's not, this was 1917. He's not in combat at this time. He's in a training ground in Canada. He just looks magnificent. So if you see pictures like that, you can understand the allure of making a movie with such people in it. It's kind of fun to look at. So we have our cowboys and cowgirls. They're on top of the horse. They gallop around, they trot around, and also they live in faraway places where nobody's around. There's barren territory, God-forsaken territory, and there isn't much law. And what law there is, it may be hundreds of miles away. So they had to fend for themselves. So what did these people do? They wore guns all the time. Pistols inside holsters, sometimes rifles stuck in saddles. So they were armed. So now we have we're going to make a silent film of cowboys and cowgirls and good guys and bad guys. And they're going to be riding these horses, chasing the bad guys, so the bad guys chasing us. And they're going to be firing these pistols back and forth. So without even a storyline, we've got action. And action on the screen was very important at the beginning of the silent era. Something has to happen up on that screen. So these cowboys chasing the bad guys chasing the cowboys, firing away left and right, smoke all over the screen from the guns. It's not hard to see that this would be a very successful formula for pictures, and the audience loved them. So we have a very successful scene, and the filmmakers just kept making these films one after the other, and however short they were and however simple they were very, very successful. Now, there's one other element to these films that needs to be addressed, and that, of course, is the existence of a very exotic figure, the Native American Indian. Now, of course, part of the Western expansion in the United States was involved outlaws, of course, involved people who, the survival of the fittest, and people who would kill you for property and not think twice. But also it was, without any other way of saying it, the persecution of the Native American Indians who actually lived on the land that these Eastern citizens were taking over. The game plan of the U.S. government was to move west, to acquire land, to settlers take up land, call it their own, to eventually call these lands territories, and eventually from territories they became states. And they kept going and going until they reached the Pacific Ocean. And this took, I don't know, as many years. It took 50 years, more than 50 years. But there were already people living in these lands, and these were the Native American Indians. And the history of this time period, the U.S. government, the U.S. military, and what they promised and didn't promise the Indians, and how they reneged on those promises, well, we have to say that that history is quite shameful. So all I like to say is I'd like to redirect you to a book I read recently that I thought was fabulous. It really talked a lot about this whole issue, but it featured on one thing. The book is called Crazy Horse and Custer, and it was written by Stephen E. Ambrose, a writer you may have heard of from other projects. But he wrote this book, and it is not only about a very famous battle in 1876, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, in which the U.S. Cavalry, 7th Cavalry, under Custer, fought against a tribe called the Sioux, and the Sioux won that battle, to say the least. But the book is much, much more than that. It's about the whole notion of nomadic tribes in North America, about how much they were the underdogs and doomed to fail against the juggernaut of the eastern U.S., which had institutions and militaries, and no matter how many soldiers they put into the field, they could double, triple, quadruple them. And it also talks about the main players on both sides of this confrontation It's very informative, very entertaining, if I can use that word, and very sad at the same time. So if you want to know more about this rather sad period in U.S. history, I would recommend that book as a good starting point. So, the genre of the Western was flourishing, and in the silent era, it was flourishing like nothing else. Again, probably as popular as the comedies were. Again, another visual medium. But all genres have peaks and valleys, and by the end of the silent era, the Western had kind of faded. It had, maybe they just run out of things to say, maybe they said the same things over and over again. For whatever reasons, it was dying. And with the talkies, of course, there was a need now for not only have visuals, but also have sound, lots of sound. And as I mentioned again in an earlier episode, the talkies promoted and eventually created this massive genre known as the musical. And the musical took off in the early 30s and was very, very successful. Now that doesn't mean that that Westerns stopped being made. They were being made. They were being made on a regular basis because the audience still liked them a lot. But Hollywood had this method of dealing with genres that were successful and genres that were less successful. So they came up with this A-list and B-list designation. Now an A-list movie is one that had the biggest budget that was allowable, that had the best talent behind the camera, however many people that were, that had track records, that had made successful films before, and were being counted upon to make another successful film, given that they were getting the best budgets to make these projects. And then finally, they would have stars. Now, Hollywood never made an A-list picture without at least one star, a star that the public wanted, loved, and wanted to see again. So we had A-list stars, A-list behind the camera, and A-list budgets. Now, it's not too hard to figure out what the B-list world was. The B-list world was smaller budgets, people behind the camera who were competent but weren't necessarily in the elite group of technicians, but who knew how to make pictures fast. And then the actors and actresses who were very competent, who had to have some kind of screen quality that the camera liked, otherwise they wouldn't be in the business at all, but were not on the same grade as the actors and actresses that the Hollywood were clamoring to see. So there were many, many, many B pictures made, and they were made fast. Now, why were there? Simple fact is that given by 1914, Hollywood was the dream factory, which meant they had to produce films. The audience couldn't get enough films, so they had to put out product. So even though all the films they made couldn't be A-list movies, because that's a lot of money, so they continued to produce B-list pictures, and lots of them, and that filled the need for the movie-going public. But by the late 30s, the directors who had been working in the silent era had been around the talkies now for almost 10 years, and they had really figured out how to reinvent themselves and make talking pictures, good talking pictures, almost as good as the last days of the silent era. And one of those directors had made an untold number of Western films in the silent era and was well acclaimed for it. He was very well regarded and actually had made some speaking movies in the mid-30s that were well received. So he was an A-list director. And since, for whatever reasons, he had a thing for making Westerns, he wanted to make another Western. I don't know anything about how the story came to him or how it fell into his lap or whatever, but his genre was the Western, and he wanted to get into that genre again. So in 1939, he made the film, and in 1939, Stagecoach was released. A film which film historians credit with reintroducing the genre of Westerns to the public, the A-list genre, and the public once again fell in love with them, and they stayed in love with the genre for the next 20 years. That director's name was John Ford, and the actor who was the star of this film would become an overnight sensation and have a brilliant career for the next 35 years, and his name was John Wayne, and we'll talk about both of them later. So, for the 40s, Westerns became very, very popular. Hollywood was pouring out Western after Western after Western. And by the late 40s, something else happened. There was an invention on the scene now, and it was television. And so television came into being as another form of entertainment. So if you're a television producer in 1949, 1950, whatever that year might have been, and you see people flocking to the theaters to watch Westerns, you're going to make Western product for television. And so the 50s saw an enormous number of Western programs. Now, there's a comic from that era who said, imitation is the highest form of television. So it's no surprise that the television producers produced Westerns. Now, I was just a pup in the late 50s. I was 4 years old by the end of the 50s, but I remember very well that my favorite TV shows were Westerns. And one in particular starred this very wholesome, good-looking, again, they always had to be good-looking and tall and look great on a horse and with a perfect cowboy hat. His name was Roy Rogers. He was a singing cowboy. I think he sang in every episode. He had a horse named Trigger. Beautiful horse, of course, named Trigger. He had a wife named Dale Evans. She was not only his screen wife, she was his wife in real life. And that was the show. I think 30 minutes long. It ran for, as far as I can remember, it ran forever, and I watched it all the time. And why I remember all this stuff, I don't know. But Westerns were what you watched when you were a kid in all through the 50s. The other thing I remember was, when it comes to toys, one of the most popular toys, what was called a cap gun or a pop gun. Now, this was a silver-colored pistol that was very fragile. It looked like you could smash it and it would fall into pieces without much effort. So they were very cheaply made, but every kid had a cap gun. And this gun required you to take a roll of paper and insert it into the gun. And on that roll of paper, there was a little piece of the paper that when you pulled the trigger and the hammer went down on the paper, it made a pop or a snapping sound. Now, it wasn't gunpowder, of course, that was impossible, but whatever it was on the paper, it made a pop. And hence they were called pop guns or even cap guns, because they were called rolls of cap. I need to get a new cap roll, I'm all out. And that cap roll would filter through the gun, so every time you pulled the trigger, it would drop down and the next cap was ready to be pulled. So these were very popular, and every kid had a pop gun. Well, the love of guns didn't stay with me at all when I grew older, but my brother became a police officer. My older brother, who watched these same shows as I did, became a police officer, and in fact, he got involved with ceremonial mounted duties as a RCMP officer. So our family was 1 for 2 when it came to what the effect Westerns had on us. So, The Searchers, released in 1956, did not have a place for a wholesome singing cowboy like Roy Rogers. It was tough. It was gritty. It had very controversial themes. It needed a director who was at the peak of his powers to bring this story to the screen and to make it entertaining, successful, and tell a compelling story within all these difficult themes. And that director was John Ford. He had made Stagecoach in 1939, was extremely well received for that. He had won many acclamations over the years, awards, and in fact Hollywood was very proud to say that John Ford was the greatest director that ever came out of Hollywood. So he was the A-list of A-list directors. And it was his job to bring this project to the screen. Now, John Ford was an interesting character. He was like Alfred Hitchcock, a director I mentioned earlier, in that he was one of the very few directors whose fingerprints were all over his movies. I mentioned Hitchcock and how if you see a Hitchcock movie, you can tell it's a Hitchcock movie. Well, the same was true for John Ford, for I think 3 main reasons. Number 1, he made Westerns. Almost every film he made in a 5-decade career was a Western. Now, not all. He had some very glaring exceptions to that, but he made a lot of Westerns. I think I've probably seen 15 or so John Ford Westerns, and I find them all eminently watchable. So if you're in a movie and you're watching a Western, you wouldn't go too far wrong if you thought it might be a John Ford Western, provided you had the other 2 pieces set up. Now, the second piece was the cast. Really elite directors had the ability to take a group of actors and technicians, keep them together, and always use them on their films. So whatever project they had, they wanted to make sure they had this same, I'll use a Western word, stable of actors and technicians to work on the film. As a director, you can probably understand that, well, these people have worked with me before. I've been very successful. They know what their job is. They're all professionals. The actors and actresses are going to come through and do what they have to do. The technicians are going to do their bit. So I really feel that I can focus on other things and not worry about whether or not this new kid or this untested technician is going to screw something up. So there's a comfort factor there. And if you watch John Ford films, you see again and again the same faces. Not everybody, but a lot of the faces appear again and again and again. And it's kind of fun to watch them. You see them, they're the same but different people. But it just reveals how much power Ford had and how he could do what he wanted to do between 1945 and, let's say, 1960. And the third element of John Ford that makes his films unique is the location of his films. So many of John Ford's films were set in Monument Valley. Now that is a valley on the border of Arizona and Utah. I looked that up. I didn't know exactly where it was, except I knew it was somewhere in the west. And geographically, it's an amazing place. It's a valley, but it's basically a desert that has these rock structures situated all over this desert. And they're not situated close by, they're all over the place. Formed, they say, by glaciers, however many thousands of years ago. And what's left are these mountains of stone that really do look like monuments. Now just imagine how visually stimulating that can be in a film. So Ford made, I don't know how many movies he made with the location being Monument Valley. I know that it's probably more than a dozen and less than 100. But so many of the films, and they all look terrific. And when you watch a John Ford film, you're saying, well, when is he going to be in Monument Valley? And sure enough, almost every time, he's in Monument Valley at some point. It's visually stunning. His cinematographers won tremendous accolades for the work they did, because, I mean, it's one thing to be in a visually stunning place. It's another thing to capture it properly. And these cinematographers, under Ford's guidance, really knew how to capture these locations. So those are the three things that make John Ford films John Ford films. And put all together, it's kind of fun. You go into a movie and say, I'm not going to tell you who directed this movie. I'll say it's a Western. You start watching, and probably within 15, 20 minutes, even if you're new to it, or if you're a studied film goer, you'd know sooner than that this was a John Ford film. A very powerful director, a very enigmatic figure, really knew how to tell a story, and really all he wanted to do, it seems from the audience's standpoint, was tell Westerns. So that was the first power behind The Searchers. The second power behind The Searchers was the actor, the leading man. And as I mentioned, his name was John Wayne. Now, I spoke about To Catch a Thief in an earlier episode, and the leading man, Cary Grant, as being the leading man in the golden age of Hollywood. I'm going to modify that a bit and say, if you were to pick two leading men from the golden decade of the golden age of Hollywood, the one that most epitomizes elegance would be Cary Grant, and the one that most epitomizes ruggedness would be John Wayne. He was a superstar and had been a superstar since 1939. He had done a lot of war films, propaganda films, which today are very hard to watch, but they served a purpose during the war when the U.S. was involved in the war between 1942 and 1945. And then after the war, he made, with John Ford, many, many Westerns, which were just terrific films that you wouldn't hesitate to watch again and again. They're so much fun and they're so well made. And his career spanned from 1939 to, let's say, 1975. I think he lived much longer than that, but his best films were probably between 1939 and, let's say, the end of the 60s. But in 1956, he was at the peak of his power. He was what a Hollywood actor, leading man, is supposed to look. He was tall, he was handsome, he was big, football star big for the time, for the 50s, not today. And even in The Searchers, there's a reference to him being called Big Shoulders, and I'll just leave it at that. He was rugged and he was tough. And The Searchers demanded of him to be the toughest he'd ever been, the ruggedest he had ever been, and the angriest he had ever been. And I think only I don't know if it was the only combination, but certainly John Ford and John Wayne were able to pull it off and have this hero play this character who was a nasty piece of work, but with a heart of gold. So how is it that Hollywood could make these stars? How did they do this? I mean, one of the things is experience. They've been in the star business since the mid-teens, since Hollywood opened its doors and started making movies. Silent stars they made larger than life. At the beginning of the talkies, it didn't take long for them to pick out the stars that the audiences loved and make them even bigger and bigger. And there's a litany of people whose names are now, I'm sure, almost completely forgotten. But in their day, they were bigger than any star today and were were admired and loved and worshipped, and they couldn't wait for the next film to come out. How did they do it? They just knew how. They had the experience to do it. They would say, okay, this is a talented actor or actress. The audience loves them. The screen loves them. But there's something about them. We're going to make them even bigger. And I think that's what set apart this golden age of Hollywood from the rest of the era of filmmaking, because they knew how to do this. I'm reminded of a story I read of another leading actor in the 50s, very famous in the 50s and early 60s. His name was Rock Hudson. A name is a name by any other name. I mean, Hollywood loved making up good names. So Rock Hudson was an unknown at the time. He went into his agent's office and he said, "I want to be a great actor." And the agent allegedly said, rather cynically, "I can't do anything about your acting ability, but I can make you a star." And in a nutshell, that was what Hollywood was all about. They could make great actors or popular actors into stars. And no actor was ever bigger, I think, than Cary Grant as the elegant one and John Wayne as the rugged one. And in 1956, John Wayne was the right guy to play Ethan, the uncle, who comes to his brother's house and finds, and after the war, and within a day or two, probably even less than that, a tragedy occurs and Ethan is mad. He's already angry, but now he's mad and angry. And in 1956, it just didn't do to make John Wayne angry, or in this case, Ethan Edwards, the character. So instantaneously, he sets out to go after the people who inflicted this tragedy and deal with them. And there's no hesitation at all, and whatever. And he also says, "I ain't ever going to stop. I'm going to keep going till I find them." End of story. Now there's another character that is involved in this, a young fellow, allegedly a teenager in the movie. He looks more young 20s. He's a friend of the family that endured this tragedy, and he feels responsible for them because they raised him, even though he's not a blood relative. And he's eager and he's young and he sees an adventure looming. And he also looks up to Ethan and he wants his approval. Ethan doesn't approve of anybody in this film. And so he wants to go with him. And there are our searchers. The Civil War veteran, tough as nails, knows his way around, and is not going to stop till he finds these perpetrators and deals with them. And the young kid who wants to make a name for himself, wants to do right by the family, and wants to learn from the master. These are our searchers, and this is our movie. What happens? Will the searchers meet up with the perpetrators? And if they do, what will they do to them? So let's all mount up, join the searchers from the 22nd row.